Welcome back, Rabbi Dr. Eliezer Brut, and we will be recording an episode on Reuven Margolis. Why now? Because we're in the middle of learning Masechta Sanhedrin, Daf Yomi, and the Margoliyos HaYam is one of the primary Seforim that's used on this Masechta, among many others. I believe Rabbi Brut mentioned it during his Masechta Sanhedrin History Throughout the Generations episode. But now we're going to do somewhat of a deep dive on removing Margolis because Rabbi Brut only wants to keep us here now for not more than 40 minutes. And he probably could spend 10 40-minute episodes discussing removing Margolis, a fascinating figure and a prolific writer and a Talmud Chacham beyond. So let's get right to it. This shir was dedicated anonymously, and we thank the donor. I remember this Sefer in yeshiva. I remember seeing it in other yeshivas. Rabbi Brut will probably jump right in. He was someone who wrote things about Hakamas HaMedina, and some people weren't happy with it. And I believe Mosai Rav Kook maybe also got involved in the censorship. So how are you? And I guess jump right into the entertaining part of this before you get to the meat and potatoes.
Okay, so we'll begin like this. We're deep into this Masechta. Everyone's Magachir, or when they learn it, they quote the Margolis HaYam, Rebuv Margolis. So today the goal is to give a small glimpse into appreciating his great literary output. The truth is, it's very hard for me to speak about one of my heroes in such a short amount of time that we allotted for it. I dream of doing a big series on him, and Mir Hashem. Each thing that I'm going to talk about, really, we could be Meirich in its own episode, but just to give a smorgasbord, as they call. So now, right away, Rabbi Shwed brought up what people, that in yeshivas, and this is true in certain yeshivas, they cross out certain statements, certain sentences in the Margolis HaYam. What is that referring to? So if you open up your a standard edition of Margolis HaYam, and the ones that if you would have bought up to a few years ago, so at the end of the Sefer, he has a sentence where he says, Nigmar betfus b'yoy malays eser shanim l'tkumas medinas Yisrael. A terrible sentence to say. So in various yeshivas, Brisk probably, and Panovich, others, they cross it out. Okay. Recently, I was talking to someone, and he told me, but in the new edition published by Rav Kook, they took out that sentence. So even Rav Kook, who, as we'll see, is responsible for publishing tons of materials of Reuven Margolis, they censored and took out this line of Reuven Margolis. Now, we're not going into this in the Kuda, but Reuven Margolis was affiliated with the Mizrahi. But this is not a discussion. We're talking about his prolific literary output, so we're not really going to get to that. Okay, now, so to begin, we're going to go backwards a little bit, and then we're going to go into his life story and his writings. So in the 1960s, the newspaper Panim El Panim, they had an interview with him. Someone went to go visit him in the library where he worked as the librarian in Sefer Rambam in Tel Aviv. And the person wrote this article, and he describes a fascinating thing. He says like this. Basically, he walks in, he's watching the whole story. People come in, a fellow comes in, starts asking questions. The guy's working on a book about Chassidus. So he asked the librarian, the Hainu Reuven Margolis, all different questions. Reuven Margolis without batting an eyelash. He gives him all different answers. He takes notes. Fine. Next person comes in, a bacher, he's getting smicha. So he starts asking Reuven Margolis, where's the svarim, the certain svarim that he needs to prepare for this? So he points to this section. Okay. Then a few minutes later, he says, also, you'll if you take out this sefer, you'll find more material for you. And then he starts quoting to this bacher literally pieces from the sefer by heart. Okay, this guy is also impressed. Then a Rav walks in, one of the Dayanim Paiskim from the Bezdin of the Tel Aviv, in the Bezdin in Tel Aviv comes in. He says, we just got a very deep, complicated question. So Reuven Margolis right away tells him, look over there in this sefer. They discuss it in this tshuva sefer from Izmir, and Rabbi Tzil Chanan has a tshuva about it, and Rabbanim in America dealt with it right away without batting an eyelash, and he shows him this farm. Okay, then the next person comes in. This guy's working on a work on poetry. So he asks him some questions. Okay, he also gives him some answers to help him. But Kitzer, this was not a rare occurrence. This happened daily from different accounts. You walked into him, he was not only a librarian, but he was a live library, as we'll see. Okay, anyway, this article talks about some of these things that he witnessed when he saw him. Okay, now So who is this person, Reuven Margolis? Where is he from? What's his story? So he's born in Lemberg, Galicia in 1890, and he dies in Eretz Yisrael in 1971. A nice long life. His teacher in his youth was his father. Later on, it was by some Yid, Rav Moshe Mezuzah. In 1931, Reuven publishes Rav Mezuzah's Torah for gratitude that he learned by him and everything, but he doesn't mention his name. Interestingly, he says HaMissader. The family asked him to help publish it, and he felt that so he did, but he doesn't even mention that he's the one who publishes it. Okay. Anyway, his father dies when he's 14, so he starts helping his mother to run their family store to provide a living for the family. He gets married when he's 18 in 1908. She dies in 1930, and they did not have any children. In 1931, he publishes his work Nefesh Chayah, which we'll get back to, naming it after her as a mitzvah for her writing, and stating that she was his partner with his Torah, the many years of learning that he learned He gets married a second time to a lady, Esther, and he does not have children from her. So Meiser Reuven Margolis was not zeicha to have children. And, okay, fine. So he's not zeicha to have children. But, Baruch Hashem, he wrote. And as we're going to see, boy, did he write. And this has left an incredible legacy out of Yom in all areas of Torah, and that's what we're going to explore today. Kitzer, when he's living in Lemberg, he was involved with different things for the masses. Example, he was asking, he was Isaac in different Nekudis, school system, I think it was. He published a Luach. But how did he support himself? He ran a Seforim store. Now, this farm store, he would put out catalogs to different people. We have letters of different people buying from him or ordering or asking him does he have these rare Seforim or regular Seforim, whatever it was. And through that, one could get a glimpse in how the Seforim market worked in those days. Now, he used to publish these catalogs. Some of them we have today. He started them up a few different times. They were called Hamodia. And in them, he would have short articles. He also would talk about Seforim that he was going to publish, or he did just publish, and he would put in these little newspaper type things, advertisements for his Seforim or Seforim that he published. Now, but this Seforim store, as one person wrote, he wonders how many Seforim did Reuven actually write, because basically it was a meeting place that people would have intellectual conversations. It was a known hot place to come to talk and learning. Okay, Lemaisa, he describes life as a store owner in his Sefer, in a letter that he wrote to Reb Chaim Hershenson that he later on publishes, or it was published in his Sefer HaMikra Mosaira. So he talks about, it seems there's a whole dion about what's the Isser to have a store open on Shabbos. What malachas are you doing? So he describes that a lot of times you might think, oh, you have a store, so you're not doing any malacha. So he describes the hardship that a person who runs a store could have, and then by the time, even though he's not doing any mekach or memkar, he's not doing anything, but he comes home. He describes that he basically would come home so exhausted that he wouldn't be even able to open up a sefer. So Kitzer, he had the store. So from this, it sounds like he did sell books a little bit, and it did take kaiches from him. But anyway, as you could see, he still somehow found time, and he spent every spare minute of time learning and writing Torah. In his introduction to his Nefesh Chayah, which we already just quoted, which is a work on HaChaim, he describes writing the work during World War I. But at that time, he was trying to dodge the draft. He had actually gotten smicha to avoid being drafted, but there was complications. So he had to hide out at home. He didn't leave the house, and he didn't even have at night when he would learn. He didn't even have candles, because then people would know that he's learning. So he would learn from the fire, from the heat. I mean, say he probably killed his eyesight, but that's how he learned, and that's how he wrote Torah, unbelievable amounts of Torah, and that's what he became famous for. He was a prolific writer of Torah. In his introduction to his most famous work, with the Margoliyos HaYam and Sanhedrin, he writes in this clever introduction about Ilfa, which is really alluding to himself, and this was his main tshuka, which was to reach Klal Yisrael through his Torah, through the printed word. That's how he says, Gagui Ilfa hein lulmoy de lami lasses as naim l'Torah l'shoyim v'kais Rishonim l'shkais tzmam l'dvar b'sichas chavim u'pirsam divrei Torah shekasav b'pink kaisav. It's just pretty much, it's autobiographical. Ki yadua, when you read this introduction, a fascinating introduction, famous introduction also. But the point is that to his notebooks, that they should get out there and people should be able to enjoy them. Okay, Lamaisa, In 1912, I mentioned he had to get smicha, so he got smicha from who? From R Meir Arik, one of the greatest gedolim of Galicia at the time. R Meir Arik writes, he's an expert in all years of Torah. I spoke to him face to face about halacha. He seems fully competent to paskin. He was also in close contact with R Meir Arik via letters, where he asked him various questions and sent him some of his works over the time to receive comments on them. In 1913, he publishes his second work called Kav V'Samim. He receives a very nice haskam from him, many comments. But the comments are only published recently. At the same time, he also gets, in 1912, he also gets smicha from Rav Moshe Babad, Reuven Lemberg. Now, interesting is the relationship between Reuven Margolis and Reb Meir Arik. We only know how extensive this relationship is thanks to Reuven Margolis' nephew, Hanania Weinberg, who is responsible for a lot of the materials of Reuven Margolis, especially in recent years, being published. A few years ago, he published via Ahavat Shalom the letters between Reuven Margolis and Reb Meir Arik, 13, 14 letters, jam-packed with material. Not censoring it, and in there we find a fascinating letter from Rav Meir Arik full of ha'aris on the Nefesh Chayah. So now, interestingly is that Rav Meir Arik gives him a ha'ara, he talks about it, and he says, Lamaisa, you should have given more credit. He's alluding to that he's saying that Reuven Margolis took some sources from him and perhaps from the Marsham. This letter was published a bunch of years ago, but that sentence was taken out. They didn't want to write that possibly Reuven Margolis plagiarized some materials, but the nephew felt out the emes, and Reuven Margolis is ish emes to publish that sentence. But bottom line is, it seems that this letter was not published in the Nefesh Chayah. Why? So Rav Meir Arik wrote there's some things that he felt are not print worthy in the Sefer, and if you're not taking them out, so don't publish. So I'm not giving haskam on the Sefer. If you take it out, then yes, you could. So Reuven Margolis ish emes, he didn't take it out, so he didn't publish this letter. And later on, we have the letter published now, but not as a letter with the Nefesh Chayah. Anyway, fascinating letter to see. Rav Meir Arik b'chol koycha. Now, when does he begin his writing career? He begins at the age somewhere of 17, although we're going to see in a second even earlier. But that's when he begins his writing career of publishing. He publishes in the various newspapers and journals at the time, and literally once he starts publishing, he never stops until he dies, publishing dozens of articles and works over the next 70 years. They were on extremely out of the ordinary wide range of genres and reprinted many times, demonstrating its popularity. In his Margoliyos HaYam, at one point he mentions a work that he wrote at the age of 11, Negei the Sugi in Sanhedrin Daf Lamed Gimel. But sadly, this work did not survive. In a work published in 1931, he wrote that he would publish over 20 works at that time already, and he has many more to publish, and he lists some of them out. Some of these works did not survive, but okay. Now, he gains fame from his writings immediately. He receives letters and comments from all over Europe, from Talmidei Chacham and scholars also. And through this, he developed relationships with many of them, not only with Rav Meir Arik, who said he had a correspondence back and forth with different things. I think this happened pretty fast, based on the incredible speed he published and republished. And from the letters which he received, which a bunch have been published in recent years, I just mentioned from this Hanania Weinberg, we can see these letters had not been published until the past 3-4 years. So he could see all the comments that he was getting from everyone. So we see that it was very popular. Lamashal, the Torah Tamima, compares him. It has a few letters with him back and forth, and he writes amazing about the Seforim, and he says, you remind me of Daderis. So when I saw the sentence, I was obviously very excited because Reuven Margolis, one of my heroes, is being equated with a different hero of mine, Daderis. But it's interesting is because the Daderis didn't publish all that much. So why is it that the Torah Tamima was even hopping on what we know of Daderis today? This makes more sense. But anyway, Lamaisa, that's the Torah Tamima says. Okay, he was Mechaven Lamitoy, but how he got to that conclusion is not so pashut. Anyway, these works were famous for their concise clarity, engaging writing style, the incredible display of breadth of knowledge, and for their originality. One of the many mysteries of Reuven Margolis was, where does this sophisticated Hebrew come from? How did he learn it? He didn't go to, him saying by 14 he's already working in a store. Another mystery is, I already said, he's writing crazy amount of works. And then the main mystery is, how does he find all this material? As we're going to see soon, the Bekias is Meshunadik. How many works does he publish? Well over 50 works. That's a crazy number. Now, Lamashal, one biographer who wrote an essay about him afterwards, who knew him personally, visited him a few times in the library, he writes that Lamaisa, it's not fair to say that he wrote only 50 works, because had he wrote very shorthand, a lot of times bekitzer with ayins and stuff like that. Had he really fully expanded it, it would have been many more volumes. You know how many ha'aris he wrote in the Zohar, which we're going to discuss soon? Over 60,000 ha'aris just on the Zohar. That's a crazy output. Imagine we're talking that on 50 Seforim besides this. Anyway, okay. What's his first work? So the first work is he publishes at the age of 22 a work, Toldos Adam, which is devoted to the classic work on Shas, the Maharsha. It's not a standard biography, but rather it's a comment on the Maharsha dealing with his library, his methods. It demonstrates a keen understanding and knowledge of the full work of the Maharsha and Shas, discussing all kinds of points on the Sefer with Ta'aris and Gans Maharsha, which is a remarkable feat. Now, the Sefer, it tackles it's tackling one of the classic works on Pshat. When one looks at the table of contents, one could see the wide range of topics that it discusses, whether besides the library and his methods. Bottom line is, it's one incredible Sefer. Now, what's interesting is it was not printed all that many times, but Baruch Hashem, in recent years, Mechona Havat Shalom has reprinted it with this Hananya Weinberger, the nephew, with tons of new additions from materials found in his own copies that he had, notes that he meant to include in later editions. And also, besides for that, it also they added in letters that he received from different people specifically about this work. Okay, so fine. Now, Lemaisa, one of the letters that he gets that's published for the first time now about the Maharsha, so a very chashuv a person that he develops a kesher with him. He has a bunch of letters with him. Yehudah Lemberg, who wrote a Sefer Chikri Leiv, he writes that it's unbelievable his Havana on the Maharsha. And he's a young fellow. He's 22 years old. It's unbelievable how he's able to put out such a work. So a lot of times, if a guy puts out this work, okay, he put it out at the age of 50. So he spent many years. He works on the Maharsha. But as I said, he's over 50 works. He continues. He publishes later on a work on the HaChaim HaKadosh. Now, this Sefer, Reuven Margolis writes in Zakdama, originally was ready to be printed in 1914 before the Maharsha. But Lemaisa, it only gets published in 1925. Technicalities, whatever. Okay. In the introduction of this work on the HaChaim HaKadosh, he discusses what's the tayelis of writing about Gedolim. One of the nakudas he throws in is Gadol Shimusha, that there's a nakuda of being Meshamish Talmid Chacham, but also when he's writing about them, it's showing the Havana in their methods and their quotes. He's quoting whole pieces of them, of Torah of them. It's not a book that one could, let's say, read in the bathroom. Okay. In the Sefer on the HaChaim HaKadosh, he has many ha'aros. He reaches out to R Meir Arik, Balak Lichemda, who's also a lot in the HaChaim HaKadosh. He has letters from Torah from him. And then he continues his work with the HaChaim HaKadosh, publishing in 1932 the Ner Lamar, where in the Hagdama, and he writes already there about how Klal Yisrael accepted the Sefer HaChaim HaKadosh, unbelievable Sefer. Pasha, Reuven Margolis was a Chassidish Yid. He put out works on Chassidus, and he was Chassidish his whole life. That needs to be emphasized. And you see from him, most likely part of why he worked on the HaChaim HaKadosh and was so special to him all his life was probably because in the Chassidish world especially, there was unbelievable chashivas for the HaChaim HaKadosh, and he writes this pretty much. And anyway, so these two Seforim were also just recently republished, the work on the HaChaim HaKadosh, his history, and then his hundreds, maybe thousands of ha'aros on the HaChaim HaKadosh called Ner Lamar. So he has two works on the HaChaim HaKadosh. They're also published, and they're recently published by Havat Shalom with letters that he received. And one person writes, Reb Shalom Feigenbaum, a gadol at that period of time who was in contact with Margolis, he says, Yebekiyas, he basically says you obviously have some type of incredible memory. There's no logic to explain how you could have this material and know so much. Okay. Anyway, these are some of his early works, and he goes on publishing, as I said, and publishes he does. I'm just going to mention some of the genres that he talks about, that he wrote about. In Halacha L'mashal. So we know he publishes the Sefer Chassidim, Rabbi Yehudah HaChassid. Until that time, there were very few works on the Sefer Chassidim. In recent years, everyone always knows, Rabbi Yehudah HaChassid, it's a Sefer Chassidim, and very famous in more recent years, but in earlier years, there's not really that many full-fledged perushim on the Sefer. There were people that wrote ha'aros on it, but one person that mamish went full out and wrote massive ha'aros on it and became a classic and published numerous times already from before World War II was Reuven Margolis, quoted already in this farm before World War II, and he kept on updating it, and it's published, available through Meister of Cook. But not only does he publish a work of the Sefer Chassidim, he goes with the tzava, because that tzava was actually what today there's an explosive amount of material relating to the tzavas Rabbi HaChassid books and articles and everything. So that he's one of the first people that, again, that also turns that into a topic that there are Seforim written before the war that he was aware of. He has notes from other Gedolim that they gave him that he got. And Bekitzer, he also includes a Toldus on Rabbi HaChassid in the work Sefer Chassidim, and that's available out of Yom. It's always available through Meiser of Kook. An incredible work. And again, if someone would just see the work that he did on the Sefer Chassidim, you'd say, how did someone do this? And then you find out that he did another work and another work and another work. And that's the story with all his productivity. Lamashal, there's a Chuvas Min HaShamayim from one of the Balei Toises. It's a famous thing that he basically would, at night, he would have questions, and then he would have a dream with the answers and how the whole process was. So it's called Chuvas Min HaShamayim. So this work, again, existed, and Gedolim knew about it. And there's a lot of conversation about it. How could you rely on what you got in a dream? So Reuven Margolis, he publishes a beautiful edition of this with tons of ha'aris, and he has an Hagdama where he deals with the concept of Chaloimis, Baskol, Gilui Elio, Ruach HaKodesh, going through Kol HaTorah Kula, incredible introduction. And there's a depressing sentence somewhere over there in one of the things that he did it over Hanukkah. His first edition of this work, he did it over Hanukkah in 8 days. You're like, how does someone have this speed? There's no computers. He's not doing computer searches that we have today or ChatGPT or anything like that. Lemais, at the end of that introduction, he says that Amir Tzashem, he has even more material in his work on the Magam Sharim, but that we never were zeicha to. Okay, this is some of the works of his that relate to halacha. Another work, which we already quoted a few times, is Nefesh Chayah. Nefesh Chayah is a work on HaChaim, intense, beautiful ha'aris of all kinds, crazy bekiyas, sometimes on off the topic, sometimes on the topic, but incredible work. I just simply love the Sefer. Every time I pick it up, I can't put it down because you always find some other interesting thing there. There's lots buried in there. He writes it in so bekitzer. And as I said, but this author has a very good ha'ara. When he wrote about Reuven Margolis, a lot of times he's conciseness, but it needs to be brought out more. So a lot of times until you find the ha'ara and what he means with this farik the ha'ara, it's a whole avodah. Now, he meets the Chazon Ish. Supposedly the Chazon Ish said on him that Reuven Margolis doesn't even know how much he knows. But he quotes up at least once the Chazon Ish, something that he heard from the Chazon Ish in his meeting with him in Nefesh Chayah, and his nephew in one of the introductions that this Hanania Weinberg, he writes he remembers he went with when he was a youngster. This Hanania is in the mid 80s, so he remembers going to visit the Chazon Ish with Reuven Margolis on Yom Tov. Anyway. He has other ha'aris on Shulchan Aruch, on the other Dalech Shulchan Aruch. It seems a lot of it was lost. Some of it has survived and was recently published by Rav Nassim Rabinovich, called Nefesh Chayah Shalem, published by Ali Zayis. He has another work that also relates to halacha called Makara Bracha. Okay. Now, moving on, as I said, he writes on all different genres. So we have an Ashkafa Lamashal. He publishes the Vikuach of Rabbi Chilmi Paris, the Vikuach of the Ramban, with ha'aris. Each one of them has introductions about the Toldus Ramban, about the Toldus Chilmi Paris. And again, he publishes a work which we mentioned briefly in the shir about the Gemaras Rabba Barchana. Rabbi Avram ben Rambam has a famous Maimer on HaGados. Rabbi Margolis publishes it, but he doesn't stop publishes it. He writes a whole essay again about the history of Rabbi Avram ben Rambam. Until today, it's considered one of the best write-ups about him. And then he publishes the Maimer on HaGados and other materials related to Rabbi Avram ben Rambam. But Kitzer, we see a Yid so far. You're like, how many lifetimes does this guy live? Continuing on, what about Shas? He writes on Shas. The Sefer, one of his earliest works was called Kav Samim. It's 102 ha'aris. Then he towards the end of his life, he publishes Nitzaitze Ar, which is ha'aris of his Angan Shas. Margoliyos HaYam, which we'll get to. Then he has a Sefer Shem Olam. What is the Sefer Shem Olam? This is just the ideas sometimes behind it. What he thought of creativity. A lot of times you learn a Gemara, and the Gemara doesn't identify as a machlokes. It says Chadam or this, Chadam or that, but doesn't identify who's who in this story. Somehow, in many of these cases, throughout Bavli, Yerushalmi, and Midrashim, Reuven Margolis figures out many times who are the two sides, and he proves it. At the time, it seems the Minchas Elazar was very impressed and sent him a letter about it. And he says a sentence. He says, "V'ebesi chibur nifla." Ki l'shem olam l'tferes ki b'mekaymis rabbis nirish akiven am mitois das hatanoim v'amiram v'shitasam. Incredible letter to get from the Munkacher in 1931. It seems that it could be that the Munkacher, when he found out he's affiliated with Mizrahi and everything. He broke off his connection with him. This is, again, not a topic to go into, but in this Chibur Shem Olam, he deals with Barichos, also the famous sugya, maybe Davar B'Shem Amra, in the Chashivas of bringing Makairis and saying over the sources B'Shem, the person that you heard it from, which is a fascinating sugya in its own right. So this is another Chibur relating to Gemara. Okay, now, as I said, he's into other things. So relating to this, I would just to briefly talk about it, he's into the Rambam. He's fascinated with the Rambam. He works on one of the things which I've discussed already in different episodes, let's say with Chaim Kanievsky, Sefer Kiryat Melech, is what's the Makarios to the Rambam. So there's been a suggestion that people have said is the Rambam might have had the Zohar. If the Rambam had the Zohar, then it would help us understand certain Rambams. So Reuven Margolis doesn't get involved with the debate if the Rambam had the Zohar. But if the Rambam did have the Zohar, he goes ahead and published a few articles showing dozens of Rambams how, if that's the case, we now have a Makar for the Rambam. So he doesn't take a stand in the actual Pulmus, which a lot has been written about. I myself wrote about it in my Sefer Ben Kessel Asar a little bit. Hope to return to it much more by Richos. I wrote about it in other places, but the Reuven Margolis, this was a chibur of his that was published in various articles, and eventually Rav Kook in recent years publishes it in one of their works called Pninim Margoliyos. Now, this is only one aspect of the Rambam he deals with. He deals with plenty of other nukus of the Rambam. He has a fancy, incredible article about stuff relating to the Hagdama of the Rambam, and deals with articles about the Ravid and all this. There was a fellow, a librarian, a Danzig, incredible Yeda and Rambam, and he wrote 2 articles just explaining Reuven Margolis as a parshan of the Rambam, and in the sugya of the Rambam and the Zohar, the chidushim of Reuven Margolis, and the whole sugya gives you a nice background in this nakuda. At one time, a Yid that I've quoted in the past that I was zeicha to have a kesher with, whose name was Rabbi Yasel Tzeinvart. So I was talking to him about Reuven Margolis. He said, we're not the Rabbi Margolis was like a Yid from the previous Galiciana Gedolim, R Meir Arik, and Rabbi Yosef Engel. And you see, Kaseder, incredible Yada in Rabbi Yosef Engel's writings. It seems he knew Rabbi Yosef Engel personally even. But the point is that there's a certain nakuda, which we're going to get to shortly, that even helps us understand a certain aspect where there is a strong connection between him and Rabbi Yosef Engel. We'll get to it shortly. History. Does he know history? So I already said a bunch of times that he wrote. First, he writes a book about the Maharsha, the HaChaim HaKadosh. He writes about the Yehudah HaChassid, Rabbi Rambam, the Ramban, Rabbi Chilmi Paris. But does he write other works? So the answer is yes. These are, we're not going to go through listing all of them. There's not enough time. But the point is, one of his famous works is a work called Yesod, HaMishnah, V'Ari Chaysel. This work deals with all the famous questions about Rebbe and the Ksivis HaMishnah. Incredible. It's not a big sefer. It's something like 80 pages, but in this sefer he deals with the Seder Shtalshalis Mimois Anshe Knesset Gdoila until Chasima, how the Mishnayos was written, and in each sentence he's mechadish things. Now, people had complaints on him that you're writing it so shorthand. There's so many different chedushim that are going on. You have to give the audience some of the makairis where your chedushim are coming from. So eventually he updates it with ha'aris and nisbachim in the back, tons of appendixes. He has something like 15 appendixes in the back where he's ma'irich on various pratim. And I remember many years ago when I first read it, as I learned it in each time one reads it, you could be aimed on many different things. It's amazing how much you could include in 2 sentences. Questions he answers, things that he says, theories, and it helps one, it's not about only if he's right or wrong on some of these theories. It helps one appreciate certain aspects when you're learning in the Gemara, how every single word in the Gemara is important for certain things. Look, he wrote a sefer about figuring out about maybe Davar B'Shem Amra with certain times it didn't say what it is. How did he do this? Crazy Yeda and Chazal. So similarly, he's able to piece together different aspects in the history of Chazal in this work, Yesod Mishnah V'Chesed. And through this incredible yada of his, you get to appreciate Torah Manim Makam Echad Ashir Makam Acher, the Lashonis of Chazal, how history really is better, even though Chazal didn't write a history work, but in the stories, Derech Agav, whether it's in Halacha or Agada, the Messiahs that come out, the yada that one can learn if one pays attention to it, is remarkable. So he was one such yid who had this crazy Bekiyas, he paid attention to it. And as I've said already many times, another such yid was Reb Chaim Kanievsky, and there are others. But this is called history of times of Chazal. What about later on? So he was an expert Jewish history also. Lemberg, which was his hometown, was a famous city of many years that had many Gedolim. Books were written about it, most notably from Shlomo Buber. So he was an expert about it. He wrote a whole series of articles on what Buber said. How did he do this? So he visited the archives very often in Lemberg. They had many archives before the war. this plays out in, let's say, in different pulmusin, historically, and he writes it's a shame that he's writing this before World War II. He couldn't have realized what was going to happen to Klal Yisrael, but basically to preserve all this material, he tried to. Lamashal, he wrote an article about the earliest printings of the Shulchan Aruch. He saw it in some rare library in Lemberg. It didn't survive, and we only know about it because he wrote down a whole shyness that he saw there, and he wrote many different works relating to history. We're not going to list all of them out. We have Rachmanis. Okay, now, but Kitzer, he has this vast career, and as I said, he's writing and writing and writing, and we have no idea how he was able to do this. The Marshal, I said he was Chassidish. He publishes many works relating to Chassidim, history on them, and Torah of theirs. I'm not going into that. That's its own story. But Lamaisa, in 1958, he publishes his Margolis HaYam and Sanhedrin. This work literally leaves no stone unturned on this large Masechta. It's full of thousands and thousands of sources dealing with everything. He doesn't skip Agada. Agada is fully treated. He deals with he brings you down to Ga'onim that are just printed at the time, the Rishonim that are just printed at the time, and forget about his Yedah Nachroinim Chazal. He has original Torahs. Again, sometimes it's written to shorthand. It's interesting that back then, in 1975, a little after he was nifter, someone who knew him wrote that he wonders if when the computers that are being invented at that time, they already heard about it, if in the future it would win out such a brain of Reuven Margolis. When one looks at the Margolis HaYam and various works of his, and you have today Yitzhak and all these things, it doesn't come close to this man's yet. Okay, just to mention a few last things. In 1935, he makes Aliyah, he moves to Eretz Yisrael. He becomes a librarian of the Tel Aviv Library, which we mentioned at the outset. He builds up this collection. He was constantly visited by experts seeking assistance based on his incredible knowledge, which he generously shared. He was a tremendous anav. Now, in this thing, he had different collections that he built up, that he collected. Lamashal, he collected pictures of Gedolim. Already in his first book on the Maharsha, he has a whole essay about the chashivas of pictures, a beautiful essay about the whole chashivas of that. He had a card catalog which he offered to people to use it. He had a card catalog of autographs. Lamaisa today, the Hebrew University, the National Library, as people like to call it, has a collection of pictures and autographs of Gedolim, and one could access it online. He had a catalog of bibliography on Seforim, incredible. Eventually, this was published in Areshet. I have no idea how he was able to read this material. He cataloged it. He publishes many articles on the subject of bibliography, and now. Just to mention two other areas is Kabbalah. Reuven Margolis, up till now we discussed, okay, he knows all Kabbalah. What about Kabbalah? So this is a unique area which he became famous for, and if he would have just focused on this, he would have remained famous Leilam Vad in that world. What happens? He writes thousands of ha'aros on the Zohar. It's estimated over 60,000 ha'aros on the Zohar. But he doesn't only work on the Zohar. He publishes the Bayer, the Zohar Chadash, everything. Now, this too demonstrates an unparalleled expertise in this area. That's what I mean. It's daimah to Rabbi Yosef Engel, because Rabbi Yosef Engel, besides for Kol Kula, was also Yid and tremendous in the areas of Kabbalah, even from the works that remained of Rabbi Yosef Engel. But we know that in manuscript he had also incredible works in Kabbalah that were lost. But anyway, he writes a work, an encyclopedia, all about the Malachim. He goes through all of Midrash Chazal, writes a whole book about this is the Malach here, and then he gives you all the information about him and all the Kabbalahs for him. He publishes from manuscript a work about Malachim from Moshe Cordovero. But now let's just focus a drop on this work about the Zohar. In 1931, he reaches out to Rav Kook for an haskama to a Sefer Nefesh Chayah. Rav Kook writes him a beautiful haskama with some comments. Okay. 1935, he makes Aliyah. One of the first things he does is he goes to visit Rav Kook. It's on Shavuos. Rav Kook was very ill and he was not really receiving visitors at the time. We have this account from one of the Shamashim of Rav Kook. It's published in the Sefer called Mechitzasai, or Rav Chechik, his name was, and he writes about the visit. They let him in. It was Reuven Margolis. Yeah. According to one report, I found that he even made a shachiyanu on seeing him. He was so happy to see him. They spoke. He encouraged him to work on his Kabbalah-related projects, as he held it was very important. Now, to understand just briefly what it is that he did with Kabbalah, so he publishes ha'aris, as I said, a crazy amount of ha'aris, and not only that, he also published ha'aris of other gedolim that he collected on the Zohar. Now, that means like this. When you open up a Zohar, so there's all types of different things that are happening in the Zohar. I'm not a makubal. I have no idea what's happening in the Zohar. But I do know one aspect in the Zohar that I was Isaac in, and that's what this is very important for Reuven Margolis, which is the world of halacha and Kabbalah, the connection. Reuven Margolis was Isaac in this, and when one learns, let's say, Magen Avram, so Magen Avram brings in the Zohar a vast amount of times, but what about the world of halacha? How would they mityaches with the Zohar? Reuven Margolis, in almost any Zohar that could possibly be related, he collects the information. Sometimes he was aimed on different things. And again, they're written so bekitzer, but they're incredible. Now, if one wants to have a full appreciation of what he did with the Zohar, Reb Zevin, who I'm very fond of as usual, quoting him. So he has a beautiful, beautiful essay explaining by Arichos 10 pages, 12 pages about all aspects of the Zohar of Reuven Margolis. But one point is, Azoy, Ki Yadua, the Zohar. So there were many works written on the Zohar. One of them was a famous work from Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Rabbi Yaakov Emden has problems with to put it mildly, with various statements in the Zohar, that they conflict different things. Chazal, they're wrong, whatever. So Reuven Margolis, every one of those horrors, there's a few hundred of them. At the place in the Zohar, he's meyashiv them. He talks about them and he's meyashiv them. Sounds bekitzer. You don't even know that. You don't even chap that that's what he's doing. He doesn't say, "Oh, Rabbi Yaakov says this," but he writes a bekitzer, and that's what happens when you look up the Makar. As I said, it's written very bekitzer, and that's some people have a complaint. It's too bekitzer. The Lubavitcher Rebbe also was very impressed with the Zohar. He wrote of Reuven Margolis. He wrote him a few letters. I think in general, he had a tain on him that even though you're bucking Chassidus, you don't bring enough Sefer Chabad. Okay, that's a different discussion. Okay, now, bottom line is that he ends up, as I said, publishing. And Meister of Kook, who we mentioned at the outset, they're responsible for publishing a lot of his materials. Eventually, the articles that he wrote a lot of times were in Sinai, which was their journal that they had going actively for many, many years. So they collected some of these and they put out this farm. Some of them he started to put out. Some of them they did. And they get tremendous hakaras to type. Out of Yom, they've been published in numerous editions. Just to focus on one last thing to show you how unique he was, is he has a chibur. It's called Lachkar Shemois v'Kinuyim b'Talmud, about names. So he has a bunch of chapters relating to names. He was already fascinated about this in other essays of his. He noticed differences in the names of the times of the Tkufa in his work. I think it's called Mikra V'Amasaira. So over there, he also has a essay. One of the essays there, where again he shows incredible knowledge in Tanakh. So already there, he has an essay about the differences that he notices between names of Tkufas Bayis Rishon and later Tkufas. But then eventually he devotes a whole chibur to names. One of the questions that he deals with in the names is, when does the development of two names happen? Because it seems that some Sefer and Yehudah, they talk about that people didn't really have two names. He shows with a Bekiyas Nifla cases of where they did have two names. That's a famous piece of his, but all the chapters over there, it's amazing how it's not just a Bekiyas. He's creative and he comes up with chaps based on all these incredible knowledge, and many different regular Gemaras and Haggadahs are put together and understood through his vast writings. To be Messiah, two last nekudas. Number one is he was a loichem. He had aspects of kanoyis. One of them is kiyadua. Even though he had relationship with Professor Gershon Shalom, but in relationship with writings that Gershon Shalom wrote about Rabbi Snipeshitz, he went out and defended Rabbi Snipeshitz, publishing a few materials about that. And at one point in time, Meister of Kook, who he had a good relationship, we published a lot of stuff with them. They published the autobiography, the Sefer Chazionis of Reb Chaim Vital. He held it's a forgery. He made a macha in front of them. This is its own story. Okay, now just to be Messiah, Azai, that already in one of his essays, he writes about how he comes to Israel in 1935, and he leaves behind a ton of Seforim and materials and library in Europe. I'm not sure what was the cheshbon, if he was eventually planning on getting it. L'maisa, a lot of it's destroyed in World War II, and he writes how sad it is, what happens in World War II. But L'maisa, even though he publishes so much, there's still a ton today. This nephew, this Hanania Weinberg that I mentioned, he's published with different people. He's assisted, most recently with Havat Shalom, the works on the HaChaim, HaKadosh, and Maharsha, because many of the works, he has tons of new ha'aris and new materials and papers stuck in. He left behind the work on Targum Yonason, a massive work. A lot of it survived. And Lamaisa, tons and tons of the letters that he has survived, and hopefully, maybe someone will reach out and to assist him, to help, all these types of things needs funding. Bottom line is, I hope I just was zeicha to give a small te'ima of the vast writings of Reuven Margolis. And as I said, honestly, every sefer of his, 50 more, they are its own stories, and a lot could be spoken about it, but I hope I was there to something. I kept it to about 40 minutes. I hope the torturing was not that bad, and this should be some insight in the great Reuven Margolis, on the Reuven Margolis, the Margoliyos HaYam on Masechta Sanhedrin.
Wow, Rabbi brought the self-deprecation that you present. I don't think anyone thinks that you're torturing them at all. And on the contrary, Rabbi brought, as I mentioned at the beginning, could provide many, many more episodes. You're welcome to reach out to him at eliezer@gmail.com or myself, shweidm@ou.org, with questions, comments, and dedication opportunities. And once again, we thank you very much and look forward to the next one.